everyone and welcome to today's video where I'll be recommending to you today 13 books for you to read during the fall, autumn, cozy, wintry, cold months. It's actually really hot right now. It's like 30 degrees. It's spring in Australia. It's hot right now. I'm melting. But in Australia the autumn and winter months have just passed, so I've had plenty of time to collect all of these books to recommend to you all today. Most of my subscribers are actually from America or like the UK, so I feel like I need to give you the autumny book recs. So here we go. I do have some stacks of fantasy and some mystery, and these are all some great books, so I'm so excited to share them with you all. But first I will start with my fantasy stack, which they're mainly like YA fantasy, but they're all amazing. So the first one I have to recommend is Vespertine, and this is by Margaret Rogerson, and this came out like in 2021. I don't actually fully remember what it was about, but I remember loving it. I believe, if I remember correctly, our main character is like a nun and she works in a morgue, and in this world there's like all sorts of different spirits. At the back it has a page actually of the different types of spirits. So there's the hierarchy of spirits, and you have first order, second order, third, and all the way up to fifth, and all these different spirits can do different things. There's some that don't do much, they just hang around, and then there's obviously some that cause some disturbances based on the way they died. Like there are the fourth order spirits that were souls lost to violence, it said, so they could have been murdered or they died in battle. And then you have the third order, which died from like illness and disease. But the fifth order, which is like the big spirits, they're called the revenants. There's 7 of them, and I believe, if I remember correctly, our main girl finds a revenant and all sorts of things happen. But I remember this being such a great time, and I think back then this was going to be a series. I'm not sure if that's still happening, because when I looked on Goodreads it doesn't say that this is the first in a series anymore, although back then it did say like 1 next to the title, because it was going to be, I believe, a duology or a trilogy. But now it doesn't look like there is going to be a sequel. I don't remember if this ended on a cliffhanger or anything, or if it was like wrapped up, but I would be interested to see if this ever does get a sequel, because I remember loving it so much. This is my first Margaret Rogerson book. She did also write An Enchantment of Ravens and A Sorcery of Thorns, which I know lots of people loved. So if you haven't read this yet, because I feel like I haven't seen anyone talk about this ever, definitely give it a go. Loved it so much. And then the next one is Bitterthorn, and I feel like I have talked about this a few times on my channel since I read it, and I loved it. It's so good. And this is about our main character Mina, who sacrifices herself to the witch that lives on this mountain near her town. And it's got such an interesting magic system. It's all surrounded by like time, as you can see, there's a little watch there. It's so interesting, and it has such great vibes, especially for the autumny winter season. I don't think you really need to hear me talking about this too much more, because I've literally talked about it at any given time. I would just definitely recommend you checking it out. So good. And now next is a really popular series, so I feel like most people have read it, but if you haven't, the Cruel Prince trilogy. I love this trilogy as a whole, but when I first read The Cruel Prince, like the first book, this one, I was a little let down, and that's only because on TikTok, when everyone was recommending it, they were all saying it was like an enemies to lovers romance, and although it is, there's not a lot of romance until like the 3rd book, because that's a true enemies to lovers, and that's what I was confused about. I thought it would be like happening right now. No, but it's a much more like deep fantasy book than everyone kind of marketed it to be. There's a lot of like political aspects, which I found so interesting. I love our main character too, Jude. She's amazing. Amazing. And I also just love the way Holly Black does fantasy. It's so magical, so much fun, and this is about Fae, if you didn't already know, and it's just so good. But when you're going into reading this, don't go in for the romance. Don't think, oh, I'm going to be reading a fantasy romance. No. No. It's a fantasy book, okay, with a romance subplot, but just so good. So good. And I still haven't read The Stolen Heir, and I really want to. That came out I think earlier this year, like in January, and I've been waiting so long to read it, but I just want to wait until it's like normal paperback size instead of like, you know, this size. You see the difference? Like, this is the Cruel Prince and that would be the size of the Stolen Heir, but I want to keep them together on my shelf, so I need it to go small before I buy it. But I just really want to read that. It's so good. But if you haven't read this yet, definitely give it a read. It's got an amazing map as well. Wow, look at that. Love it. Love it. So good. And then next is one that I feel like would be a hit or miss for many people because it is very cheesy but so much fun, and that would be Crave by Tracy Wolff. This is a vampire book and this is like a paranormal romance, but it's set in like a boarding school. It's giving Legacies, if you ever watch that show, which is like the spin-off of Vampire Diaries. It's got all sorts of different paranormal or supernatural creatures. We've got like shifters, witches, vampires, all sorts of things, and it was just really good. It was so funny. I read this back in February and I loved it. It's so interesting and I really want to read the rest of the series. I believe it's like 6 books or something. Like crazy, and it's quite thick as well. But the things that happen in here, it's very entertaining. So I would definitely give it a go if you haven't read it already. The cover is giving Twilight, which I haven't read, which I know I should have. And I was really planning to read it this winter, but I don't know, I just got so busy with like uni assignments and stuff. But I will get to that soon. But this, if you have read Twilight and you enjoyed that and you want more vampire, teen-ish romance books, here you go, Crave. There you go. And the last like fantasy-ish book that I have to recommend is one that I will recommend at any given chance. It is Six of Crows. I love Six of Crows. It is everything to me. I love it. It's a found family, it has a heist, it's a fantasy, and it's amazing. Leigh Bardugo, I love you. Once again, it has a map, and I'm a big lover of a fantasy map. This one has 2. Great. But yes, I don't really know what else I could say to convince you to read this book other than that it is my absolute favourite of all time. If there was such thing as a 6-star book, this would be it. And a funny thing, that because I love it so much, in my book club group chat, we all have like funny names. My nickname that was given to me is the 7th Crow because I love this book. If you haven't read it, read it now. Read it now, and then after you finish this, immediately read Crooked Kingdom. You have to. And then you have to get your tissues because you will cry. But so good. So good. So good. Definitely read it. Now this next book is like a horror and a sci-fi book, which I thought was rather strange while reading it, but I feel like lots of people that enjoy like a horror sci-fi genre will enjoy this, and that is Wilder Girls. I did like this, but I was like grossed out in some bits because it's like, it is gross. It's about this like girls boarding school which is like kind of on an island somewhere. I don't really know, somewhat secluded, but what happens is there's like this disease or something that infects the whole school basically, and all the girls get these weird like mutations, like some like their skin falls off, or they get like weird claw things, or their eyes fall out. I don't know, but it was gross but very interesting. So the whole school is basically in quarantine, and it follows our main character, can't remember what her name is, Hetty, and her friend goes missing, but like it's mysterious because where could she have gone in the quarantine? So they're trying to like figure out what's happening there. It's kind of gross but very interesting to read about and very spooky, so I guess it would be good to read around like October time for Halloween because it's like a horror movie. It is. And then next I have like 2 YA mysteries, the first one being Ace of Spades, which this one was absolutely wild. Just read the trigger warnings before you read it because there's like some crazy things. But this is set in like an elite private school, and we have our 2 main characters. It is actually a dual POV, but they're getting like blackmailed. It's basically like Gossip Girl with extreme racism, but the whole school gets these messages from an anonymous texter who calls themselves Aces. That's where the Ace of Spades comes from. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy, but so interesting to read about. Would definitely recommend. The next book is actually the first in a mystery series, and that is Truly Devious, and this follows our main character Stevie Bell, who is invited to this elite academy called Ellingham Academy, and it's in Vermont, which I mean, it feels like the autumny vibes when you read this book. You got like the pine trees. It's a boarding school, which we love. The moose. But Stevie was invited to the school based on her want to solve this murder that happened like years back. So she's like using her detective skills. She wants to solve this murder from the past, but then a murder happens in the present. Absolutely crazy. It's so interesting. I love this so much. I like devoured all of the books. So right now I believe there's actually like 5 books. There's the main trilogy, but then there's like 2 extra books which I haven't actually read yet. I believe it's called The Box in the Woods and 9 is it Liars? 9 something. They look really interesting too. Don't really know what they're about. I believe The Box in the Woods follows like the main characters, but they go to summer camp and they solve a mystery or something like that, which sounds super fun. But the trilogy though, which is what I've read, would definitely recommend you read all those books. So good. This one has a map and I love a map. Oh. If I had the time to reread a whole series, I would read this because it's so good. Next, I have some adult mystery books, and the first one being Death of a Bookseller. I read this a couple months ago and it was so interesting. But this book was like absolutely wild. It was like stalkery, kind of scary, kind of spooky, kind of fun. I really kind of enjoyed this. You get to see both sides of the stalking, from the stalker to the stalkee, because it is a dual POV. So we have our main characters Roach and Laura, and Roach becomes obsessed with Laura and really wants to like be her friend, and she kind of like morphs into Laura, which is really strange to see, and all sorts of stuff happens. But I just really recommend you read this. It was kind of wild. And that ending, oh, the ending. Oh, like I still don't really know what happens because it was somewhat open-ended, but it was wild. And then this next one is somewhat of like a dark academia because it follows like a murder in a boarding school, much like Truly Devious, but this one happens previously, and then we have the main character who is like a podcaster now, and she's going back to try and like solve the murder because she believes the person who was put in prison did not actually commit the crime. But this one is called I Have Some Questions for You. I also did read this earlier on in the year and really enjoyed it. But yes, you definitely have the dark academia fall autumn vibes, and once again it's at like a fancy boarding school. But my question is, why are all these fancy boarding schools having murders? You pay that much to attend these fancy schools and then there's murders happening? My gosh, someone needs to sort that out. But no, very interesting to read about. And I love a good boarding school or like a fancy school book, which you can definitely tell from this video, because how many have I actually had so far? I've had 5. We've had 5. So I love a good fancy school. But next we're going into the cozy genre, but since we're on the little mystery train, we're going to continue that with Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers, and this is by the same author as Dial A for Aunties. I loved that book series. It was Dial A for Aunties and 4 Aunties and a Wedding, and I believe there's going to be a 3rd one in like January, February next year or something, but super soon, and I'm so excited to continue that series because I love it so much. But this, I think, is a standalone, and it follows Vera, who has a tea shop, and then someone dies in her tea shop, so she kind of takes it upon herself to solve the mystery, and she like interviews all the suspects, but then kind of makes like a little found family. It's so fun and so cute, and I loved it so much. But even though it is like an actual murder mystery, someone did die, it's not scary or anything. Like, this is a cozy mystery, so if this is something you're looking for, definitely recommend this one. It was great. And this does have multiple POVs as well from all the different characters, and they're all somewhat involved because obviously they're all the suspects in the crime, so you get to kind of like figure out who you think did it along the way, and it's great. And the next cozy book that I have is a cozy fantasy, which is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I read this in my cozy fantasy reading vlog a couple months ago, and I loved this so much. This was definitely like one of my favorites of that video. Definitely recommend. It's about our main character Mika, who is a witch, and she posts like witchy videos on YouTube, and people think like she's a fake witch, but she's a real witch. And then she gets an email one day from these people asking if she can teach these 3 young witches to do magic, basically. But she's confused because in this world, if witches come together, the magic can go a bit crazy and it's not safe. So witches are quite solitary, and she's like intrigued to see why these 3 witches are together. So she does end up going to this little cottage called Nowhere House, and she teaches these children, and it's just so much fun. I loved it so much. This was a 5 stars for me instantly. Like, I loved it. And I believe this author is also writing another little cozy mystery with a witch for next year, and I don't know when that's coming out, but that also looks super, super good. And if you haven't read this, would definitely recommend. I feel like lots of people have heard of this, but if you actually haven't picked it up yet, now is the time to do so. Perfect timing, and it's just so good. Maybe even read it over like Halloween. It's not scary, but it's so much fun. And I loved it. And the last book that I have to recommend today is a classic, actually, and it's one of the only classics that I feel like I've fully enjoyed, and that would be The Picture of Dorian Gray. I love this book so much, and I have the Penguin Clothbound Classics edition of this, which just makes it look so fancy and fun, and I love it. But if you've never heard of this book before, it's like a gothic book, again, perfect for the season, and it's about our main character Dorian, who basically sells his soul so that he can look as young and beautiful as the painting that was made of him. It's very interesting to see like how Dorian kind of falls down the rabbit hole basically and is turned into like a terrible person along the way, and yeah, just very interesting, very spooky. Would definitely recommend if you're in the mood for a classic but you didn't know which one would fit the spooky gothic vibes of the season. Here we go, there you are, Picture of Dorian Gray. But those were my 13 books that I have to recommend for your fall, autumn, winter season. Hope you found some new books to add to your TBR, and if you have any other autumnal books that you would like to recommend to other people, make sure to chuck them in the comments so we can all see your recommendations. But that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week with a new video. Goodbye!